It was a quiet Thursday night when a knock came at the door. Not a regular knock either, more like a pounding you'd expect during a police raid. My pregnant wife opened the door, expecting maybe a neighbor needing help. Instead, a stocky man in a black vest marked HOA enforcement shoved his boot into the doorway and pulled a knife. He looked her dead in the eye and said, "You people need to learn how to follow the rules." I stood just 20 feet away, frozen for a second, then calmly reached into my pocket and pressed the panic button on my car keys. Somewhere in the garage, a silent alarm triggered, and our porch cam began recording. I didn't yell. I didn't panic. I simply said, "You just bought yourself a problem bigger than you understand," and walked toward the gun safe. That was the moment the thug realized he picked the wrong door. Just 2 hours earlier, the evening had been normal. My wife and I had been planning the nursery layout, arguing over paint colors and whether or not a stuffed giraffe was really a necessary addition. I had gone out to the garage to look for an old paint swatch when I heard the knock. At first, I ignored it. We get the occasional package or campaign flyer, and usually the dogs bark before I even hear the bell. But when I heard the second bang, louder, faster, I started walking back inside. My wife had already reached the door and opened it before I could call out. I heard her voice say something calm like, "Hi, can I help you?" Then I heard a man, gruff, impatient, talking over her. By the time I got to the entryway, I saw him leaning in, hand on the doorframe, clearly agitated. He was wearing cargo pants, boots, and a black vest with a cheaply stitched patch that looked like it came from an online surplus store. HOA enforcement doesn't even exist. I knew that. Everyone with a brain knew that. But this guy was waving around a clipboard like he was some kind of authority figure. And then, as my wife tried to close the door, he jammed his boot in the gap and pulled a small knife from his pocket, flipping it open with a click that immediately spiked my adrenaline. I'll never forget the look on my wife's face. It wasn't fear, it was something colder. She had been through enough already with the HOA and their harassment. But this crossed into a whole new category. And as I stepped into view, her eyes locked with mine. No screaming. No chaos. Just a silent communication between two people who had been through their fair share of fight. I calmly pressed the panic button hanging from my belt loop. It wasn't just for the car. That button connected to the house's security system. Cameras, alerts, and automatic evidence upload. We had installed it after the HOA accidentally fined us for a fence they claimed didn't exist, then removed the fine after losing the paperwork. That night, I was glad I over-prepared. The man looked at me and hesitated, knife still in hand. I didn't say a word. Just turned around and walked slowly down the hall to the basement door. I could feel his confusion as I unlocked the door and descended. By the time I returned, he was gone. I didn't have to chase him. The system already tagged his face, captured his plates, and pinged the footage to our secure cloud. Within minutes, law enforcement was on their way. Rewind a few weeks, and the signs were already there. The HOA had recently elected a new president, Karen Westbrook, who came in swinging like she was running for sheriff in a spaghetti western. She rolled out new policies without board votes, created ridiculous enforcement rules like no driveway chalk and no garage doors open longer than 5 minutes. The neighborhood was furious. But Karen had a strategy: intimidate the quiet ones and surround herself with yes-men. That's when her volunteer HOA patrol started showing up. They wore cheap vests and used old two-way radios to march around like they were some kind of private police force. I brought it up at the last meeting, asked where the authorization came from. Karen responded with a smirk and a patronizing, "Some people just don't like accountability." Nobody voted for patrols. Nobody authorized weapons. But when I asked to see the minutes, they had already been archived. I tried to warn the neighbors. I even made flyers explaining the limits of HOA power and the legal risks of letting untrained security act on behalf of the board. Most nodded along. A few even told me to run for president next term. But the problem was immediate. Karen wasn't waiting. And clearly, neither was her thug squad. Back in the present, once the man ran off, I made sure my wife was okay, double-checked the footage upload, and sat with her while waiting for the sheriff. She was visibly shaken but composed. We had been through worse. She had once had to testify against a former coworker who stalked her for months. She didn't scare easy. But this? This was different. It happened on our doorstep, in our supposed safe neighborhood. And it wasn't just some random criminal, it was someone backed by a community board pretending to enforce the rules. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, they didn't waste time. One look at the footage and they immediately recognized the gravity. The man was identified within hours thanks to facial recognition and license plate data. Turns out, he wasn't even a resident. He lived 2 towns over and had been hired, unofficially of course, by Karen herself. Apparently, he was a friend's cousin who volunteered because he believed in clean communities. The deputy looked me in the eye and said, "Sir, if you hadn't had cameras and composure, this could have gone a whole different way." He wasn't wrong. That night I didn't sleep. Neither did my wife. Instead, I started preparing every piece of evidence I had, from the HOA emails to the footage, to my prior complaints, all organized in a zip drive. I didn't want revenge. I wanted justice. And by morning, justice was already knocking on Karen's door. Because that wasn't just an angry man with a knife. That was an act of aggression enabled by an unregulated HOA gone rogue. And I had just started to fight back. The basement safe wasn't just some gun locker I bought from a big box store. It was custom built into the foundation, hidden behind a false wall panel I installed myself. When I said I was unlocking something necessary, I meant it. Years ago, I worked as a federal security contractor, the kind of job that teaches you to stay 5 steps ahead of threats, not 2. While most people stocked up on flashlights and canned goods, I invested in tactical gear, biometric locks, and a security system with redundant power backup. I never thought I'd need any of it against my homeowners association, but that night changed everything. My wife sat on the couch clutching a glass of water, her hands steady even as her eyes darted toward every sound. The adrenaline had passed, but the reality hadn't. Someone sent a man to our home with a knife, and now that someone was about to meet a version of me they hadn't anticipated. When the safe opened, I took only what I needed. I holstered my Glock 19, secured in a retention rig under my flannel, and double-checked the mag. I wasn't preparing for a firefight, but I wasn't walking into the next interaction blind either. It wasn't about showing force. It was about being prepared in case this fake enforcement squad decided to come back in numbers. They'd underestimated us once. I wasn't giving them another shot. I reviewed the porch cam footage on my tablet, scrubbing through it frame by frame to capture his face, posture, and the way he held the knife, blade out, aggressive, just enough to be classified as a threat. His boot on the doorframe made it worse. That crossed the line from intimidation into unlawful entry. With everything documented, I sent the entire package to a secure cloud drive and backed it up on 3 separate devices. 15 minutes later, red and blue lights spilled into our living room. The deputies didn't come in casually either. They swept the perimeter, checked the windows, and made sure no other HOA thugs were lurking nearby. I greeted them at the door, weapon already secured back in the safe. They appreciated that. Once inside, I gave them a full account, handed over the footage, and provided my wife's statement. She was composed, measured, but you could tell something had shifted in her. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She just stared forward, answering every question like she was in a deposition. Her calm made the room colder. One deputy asked if she wanted to press charges, and her answer was immediate. Absolutely. By midnight, they had already identified the suspect using facial recognition from the footage. His name was Daryl Riems, a 34-year-old with a long trail of minor infractions, including trespassing and impersonating private security. Nothing violent on record, but his behavior showed a pattern. The biggest twist? He wasn't a resident. He didn't live in our neighborhood. He didn't even have a friend here. His connection? Karen Westbrook. She had apparently referred to him as her neighborhood safety consultant in several internal emails we weren't supposed to see. One of the deputies hinted they might be more than just friends, considering the number of HOA checks he cashed last quarter. That's when it started clicking together. The next morning, Karen made her move. She strutted up our driveway like she was about to deliver cookies, wearing her usual pastel suit and oversized sunglasses like she was auditioning for Real Housewives of the Suburbs. She didn't even knock. She rang the doorbell twice and folded her arms like she was doing me a favor by waiting. I opened the door only halfway, made sure the security camera was recording, and said nothing. She launched straight into her speech, no apology, no shame. She said the man from last night was just trying to remind us of our community rules, and that perhaps he came off a little strong. A little strong? He pulled a weapon on my pregnant wife. I didn't answer her. I just held up my phone, tapped the screen, and played the video of the knife being flicked open. Her smile disappeared. She took a step back, glanced at the camera, and said, "You know, there are two sides to every story." I told her she should probably start preparing hers for the sheriff's office because the footage was already with them. She turned and walked off without another word, but not before mumbling something about defamation and community safety. I almost laughed. Karen was clearly used to getting her way, but she had no idea how far this situation had escalated beyond her HOA power games. Later that day, I drove to the sheriff's office to provide a formal statement and hand-deliver a digital evidence package. On the way out, I bumped into Deputy Alvarez, the same guy who had responded the night before. He pulled me aside and said, "Off the record? That woman's about to have a very bad week." Apparently, they'd received multiple complaints about HOA enforcers harassing residents, but no one had evidence strong enough to press charges. Until now. My footage had opened the floodgates. One neighbor already came forward saying they were followed by a black SUV with tinted windows after attending a dissenting HOA meeting. Another reported a late-night knock similar to ours but hadn't answered. By the time I got home, word had already started spreading. A neighbor 2 houses down flagged me over while I was checking the mail. He asked if it was true someone pulled a knife on my wife. I told him it was. His jaw dropped. Then he told me Karen had approached him 2 weeks ago asking if he knew anyone willing to help keep order, whatever that meant. She offered him $50 to wear a vest and patrol the neighborhood on weekends. He thought it was a joke. Now he was worried he should have reported it sooner. That night, I compiled everything into a report I called the HOA incident file. It included the porch cam footage, timestamps, Daryl's criminal record, screenshots of Karen's involvement, and statements from my wife and me. I didn't send it to the HOA board. I sent it directly to every homeowner in the neighborhood, complete with a subject line that read, "This is what happens when you let power go unchecked." The response was immediate. I received over a dozen emails from neighbors who had been fined, stalked, harassed, or otherwise manipulated under Karen's new rule. Many admitted they hadn't spoken up because they didn't want retaliation. Now, with evidence and momentum, they were ready to act. I knew then that this wasn't just about what happened on my porch. It was about the system Karen had built, a fake power structure hiding behind real HOA rules. She had taken a neighborhood and turned it into her personal kingdom, complete with foot soldiers and a warped idea of justice. But now the curtain had lifted. And this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The HOA meeting that night was scheduled like every other, held in the community center at 7 p.m., open to residents with stale coffee and barely functioning ceiling fans. But this one wasn't going to be business as usual. Word had spread like wildfire. The emails I sent had done more than just inform, they had ignited something. People who had never bothered to attend a single HOA meeting were now filing in with crossed arms and narrowed eyes. You could feel the tension crackling in the air like static. Normally, these meetings struggled to attract 10 people. That night, there were nearly 50. And at the front of it all, seated like a queen behind a fold-out table with printed agendas, was Karen Westbrook, still wearing her pastel cardigan like it made her immune to consequences. I walked in carrying a small projector and a laptop bag. A few heads turned. Karen didn't acknowledge me at first, too busy pretending to organize papers she wasn't actually reading. The room buzzed with hushed conversations. Some whispered about the knife. Some about the guy who had finally stood up to her. A few exchanged knowing nods. When Karen finally tapped her clipboard and began speaking, her voice was sugar-coated but cracked just slightly under pressure. She thanked everyone for attending, mentioned the unexpected spike in interest, and launched into agenda items that had nothing to do with what everyone was there for. Landscaping updates, pool maintenance, summer barbecue scheduling. It was a pitiful attempt at deflection. But she couldn't run from it. Not this time. When she asked for any new business, I stood up, walked to the front, and without asking for permission, plugged my laptop into the projector. Karen immediately said, "Sir, if you have something to say, please follow procedure and—" But she didn't finish the sentence. Because the screen lit up with the paused video of Daryl standing on my porch, knife clearly visible in his right hand. The room fell silent. I pressed play. Gasps erupted almost immediately. The footage was crystal clear. Daryl's voice rang out across the speakers, aggressive, threatening. My wife's calm response. The moment he pulled the knife. The panic button beep. Me walking away, saying the words that had now gone viral among the neighborhood's private group chat. You just bought yourself a problem bigger than you understand. I stopped the video right after that, letting the silence sit like a stone in the middle of the room. Karen stood up, visibly flustered, and said, "This has nothing to do with HOA business." But a man near the back interrupted her. He shouted, "Are you serious? You sent a thug to threaten someone's pregnant wife. You think that's not our business?" Another voice chimed in, "You let strangers play security guard with weapons. That could have been any of us." Someone else yelled, "You never had board approval for this patrol thing." It spiraled from there. Voices rose, people began shouting over each other. Karen tried to regain control, banging a plastic gavel like it meant something, but no one was listening. That's when one of the quieter neighbors, a soft-spoken retiree named Linda, stood up and said, "She told me I couldn't hang my wind chimes because they were weapons in a windstorm." People laughed, but not in a kind way. More like the kind of laugh that comes when anger breaks through the surface. Another resident said he'd been fined for leaving his trash bins out for 12 minutes after collection. One woman said she was warned for having too many tomato plants. Karen had turned small rules into weapons, and now the neighborhood realized they'd been targets all along. Then came the twist no one saw coming. A man in a navy blazer stood up near the front row. I didn't recognize him at first, but others clearly did. He introduced himself as Craig Marlowe, former vice president of the HOA before Karen took over. He had moved out 6 months ago but had shown up that night after hearing what happened. And he had receipts. Literal ones. Printed emails. Meeting minutes. Correspondence between Karen and the rest of the board. In one of them, Karen had forged Craig's name to push through emergency powers after his resignation. Another showed her suggesting the idea of volunteer security as a way to enforce compliance faster without the board's delays. Then came the real bombshell, an email where she described Daryl by name and said he was just aggressive enough to get people in line. The room exploded. People shouted, cursed, some even walked out and started calling legal hotlines right there in the parking lot. Karen tried to deny everything, claiming the emails were edited or taken out of context. But the timestamps and email headers were too solid. Craig had backed everything up before leaving, suspecting this kind of stunt might eventually come to light. He wasn't surprised, it just took longer than he expected. As the yelling reached its peak, Karen slammed her folder shut, stood up, and screamed, "You're all being manipulated by lies and videos. You think he's the hero? He's got a gun safe, for God's sake." That backfired spectacularly. One of the elderly women sitting near the front snapped, "And thank God he does. You sent a criminal with a knife to our doorstep." Karen looked around and realized she was alone. No backup, no support. Just a sea of angry neighbors and damning evidence lighting up a projector screen. I didn't have to say another word. Someone called for an emergency vote. That was within the bylaws. If a majority of homeowners in attendance called for it, it could be executed on the spot. Karen shouted that the vote was illegal, that they couldn't remove her without a board quorum. But the former VP explained, with a certain glee, that she dissolved the board herself last month in a power move, claiming emergency restructuring. That meant there was no quorum. Just her. And without a functioning board, the community's homeowners had full authority. The vote took less than 5 minutes. Out of 53 people in attendance, 50 voted yes. 2 abstained. 1 voted no, Karen. But even she knew it didn't matter anymore. She grabbed her bag and stormed out, muttering about lawsuits and calling her attorney. Someone from the back muttered, "Better make it a criminal defense lawyer," and laughter erupted again, this time with actual relief behind it. After the meeting, I was approached by nearly every person in that room. Some shook my hand. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. A few offered me a seat on the board. I declined but told them I'd help rebuild things properly. It wasn't about running the HOA. It was about making sure something like this never happened again. One neighbor, an older man with a Vietnam veteran hat, said, "I've seen some stuff in my day, but I never thought I'd be grateful for a guy with a Glock and a camera in the suburbs." That night, I went home and sat with my wife on the porch. The air felt lighter somehow. The weight that had settled on the neighborhood for months had finally cracked and lifted. It wasn't over, not with legal consequences still to come, but it was the first night in a long time that felt peaceful. And for the first time since that knife came out, we both breathed easy. The HOA thug was in custody. Karen had been voted out. But best of all, the community had found its voice. And there was no turning back. The fallout began faster than anyone expected. The morning after the vote, Karen's name was stripped from every HOA document, mailbox placard, and newsletter draft. The new interim leadership, formed from the residents who had stood up during the meeting, wasted no time in filing a formal police report to follow up on Daryl's actions and Karen's enabling behavior. But that was only the beginning. When the sheriff's department received the full evidence package compiled by myself and the community, they escalated the situation immediately. It wasn't just an assault case anymore. It was impersonation of an officer, unlawful entry, conspiracy to intimidate, and possibly misuse of HOA funds. The district attorney personally called me 2 days later. He wanted a full statement on record and hinted that the county was preparing formal charges against Karen. What began as an incident on our front porch had now spiraled into a full-blown legal storm, and Karen was right at the center of it. At first, she tried to play it cool. She posted a long, rambling message in the neighborhood group chat claiming she was the victim of a smear campaign. She blamed me, claimed the video was heavily edited, and said Daryl had only acted in self-defense against a hostile homeowner. The comments underneath didn't go how she expected. Residents tore into her. One person posted, "So pulling a knife on a pregnant woman is self-defense now?" Another wrote, "You sent a man to my house last month to take pictures of my kids' toys in the yard. That's not leadership, that's stalking." Within minutes, the entire thread turned into a digital courtroom, and Karen was losing hard. She deleted the post, but screenshots were already circulating. The first court date for Daryl was scheduled barely a week after his arrest. It was just an arraignment, but the courtroom was packed. I sat near the back with my wife beside me, her hand resting gently on her stomach, as if shielding the baby from the ugliness in the room. Karen showed up, too, sitting several rows ahead with her arms crossed and a look of smug defiance plastered across her face. She tried to avoid eye contact with me, but I could tell she knew this wasn't going away. The prosecutor laid out the charges: aggravated assault, trespassing, impersonating a public official, and 1 count of felony intimidation. Daryl's public defender tried to downplay the incident, calling it a misunderstanding. But when the judge asked if he had any training, license, or authority to act as a security officer, Daryl shook his head and said, "Karen told me it was fine." That's when everything shifted. The judge paused, looked directly at Karen, and asked the prosecutor if she was being investigated as well. The answer came swiftly, yes. The courtroom gasped. Karen turned red. I could see her jaw tighten as her carefully built world of control and manipulation began to crack. The judge ordered Daryl held without bail pending further psychiatric evaluation due to the nature of the threat. Karen rushed out the side door before the reporters could swarm her. But the worst was still ahead for her. The very next day, she received a subpoena to appear for a deposition regarding her role in organizing and funding the so-called HOA enforcement program. At first she refused. Then she lawyered up. When the deposition finally took place, the transcripts read like a self-destruct button being pressed 1 word at a time. Karen claimed she never authorized anyone to carry weapons. But then the prosecutor pulled up one of her own emails, where she said, "Make sure Daryl carries something for visual intimidation." Her lawyer visibly sank in his seat. When asked about the HOA funds used to pay Daryl under the table, Karen insisted they were reimbursements for maintenance services. But there were no maintenance logs, invoices, or contract. Only Venmo screenshots with emoji-labeled payments like "muscle" and "problem solved." As her lies unraveled, so did her composure. By the 3rd hour of questioning, she was visibly shaking. When asked if she had any law enforcement background, she said she had done some community safety workshops online. The prosecutor responded, "So you're not law enforcement, but you created your own with no training or authority, and gave them assignments?" She had no answer. The deposition ended with her pleading the fifth on 3 key questions. The damage was done. Then came the insurance bombshell. The HOA's policy provider launched their own investigation once criminal charges were mentioned. It didn't take long for them to declare that Karen's decisions fell well outside the bounds of insurable activity. That meant the HOA was personally liable. And since Karen had dissolved the board and operated as a one-woman regime, she had no shield. The association's lawyer explained this in a community email that was both clinical and brutal. The homeowners were furious. Lawsuits started brewing. People who had been fined illegally demanded their money back with interest. One neighbor even filed for emotional distress after Karen's enforcer allegedly followed her teen daughter home from school. With the pressure mounting, Karen tried a last-ditch media play. A local news crew showed up on her doorstep. She agreed to an interview, standing in front of her meticulously trimmed hedges, still trying to play the misunderstood leader. She claimed everything she did was for the safety of the community and that she was being vilified for trying to make the neighborhood better. But then the reporter asked her what she meant when she texted Daryl, "Let them feel scared." Karen stammered, called it a joke, and then tried to pivot. But her mic was still hot and she muttered, "They're all idiots anyway," just before walking off. That clip went viral. The community's reaction was immediate. Her remaining supporters, if any existed, vanished. The news station replayed the interview with a banner that read, "HOA from hell?" in bold letters. Even state officials began looking into oversight laws for neighborhood associations. Karen had gone from queen bee to cautionary tale in record time. For us, the weight started lifting. The civil suit we filed progressed quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Between the video footage, the forged emails, the misused funds, and the harassment stories from neighbors, the case was rock solid. Our attorney told us we could settle early if we wanted, but my wife said, let it go to court. Let them hear everything. She wanted it on record, wanted it to be a lesson not just for Karen, but for any group that thought fear was a valid form of governance. We spent the next few weeks gathering witness statements. Some came in handwritten letters, others in quiet conversations at our doorstep. People apologized for staying quiet. Others thanked us for speaking up. A few even confessed they were afraid of retaliation, especially from Karen's so-called patrol squad. One man revealed he had filmed an interaction where another enforcer yelled at his kids for riding bikes on the sidewalk. That footage, too, would become part of the larger case. In the meantime, our house slowly returned to normal. My wife focused on her pregnancy, finding small moments of peace in the nursery. We'd finally started decorating again. I reinforced our security system, not because we were afraid anymore, but because we had learned just how quickly safety could become fragile. The threat was no longer at our doorstep. It was in the courtroom, and it was losing. We didn't want revenge. We wanted accountability, and we were getting closer by the day. By the time the final court hearing arrived, the courthouse was packed not only with neighbors but also with a few curious local journalists who had been following the case like it was a courtroom drama. Everyone had seen the viral clip, the porch cam footage, and the news segment where Karen's mic caught her calling residents idiots. Now they wanted to see how it would end. The judge presiding over the civil suit was a stern, gray-haired man with zero tolerance for nonsense. From the moment he entered the courtroom, he made it clear that this was not just a petty HOA dispute. It was a matter of community safety, abuse of power, and personal accountability. Karen sat stiffly at the defense table, her lawyer flipping through a binder filled with excuses that were no longer effective. Her hair was tightly pulled back, makeup immaculate, but none of that could hide the fact that she looked worn down. The smug expression she used to wear like armor was gone. All that remained was someone clinging to the final thread of denial. Our attorney opened with a calm, calculated presentation. He didn't start with the video. He started with the community testimonies. One after another, residents described the fear, stress, and disruption caused by Karen's reign. A single mother explained how her teenage son had stopped biking in the neighborhood after being yelled at by one of the enforcers. An elderly couple revealed that they had considered moving because Karen fined them for having a flag mounted at an unsanctioned angle. A soft-spoken man recounted how he had been followed home late at night by someone in an SUV with blacked-out plates and a vest identical to Daryl's. Then came the video, played in full, without commentary. The moment Daryl pulled the knife. My wife's voice, steady but firm. My line about unlocking the gun safe. And finally, the police arrival. The courtroom was dead silent. Karen's defense tried its best to argue that Daryl had acted on his own, that she never gave any orders encouraging intimidation, and that the emails and texts were taken out of context. But by now, the pattern was undeniable. Each message painted a clearer picture, one where Karen had deliberately used fear to enforce her vision of order. She tried to shift the narrative by painting herself as a victim of community backlash, a woman simply trying to keep her neighborhood beautiful. But when the judge asked her why she continued to deny wrongdoing despite overwhelming evidence, she didn't have a coherent answer. She said she felt betrayed by the residents she tried to protect. The judge didn't blink. He told her that leadership without accountability is not service, it's tyranny in disguise. The ruling came that same afternoon. Karen was found personally liable for damages and emotional distress caused to my wife, myself, and the community at large. The court awarded a total of $275,000 in compensation, most of it directed to my wife for the trauma and risk she endured during the knife incident. But that wasn't even the part that hit Karen hardest. The HOA, under new leadership, filed a separate lawsuit to recoup funds misused during her time in control. She lost that one too. Her personal bank accounts were frozen, her property liened, and her once pristine Lexus was repossessed right in front of her house with half the neighborhood watching. Someone even live-streamed it, and by morning, a video titled, "Karen's Lexus Gets Towed, Justice for the HOA" was trending locally. What followed was almost poetic. Karen moved out within 2 weeks, her house going up for a rushed private sale to cover her legal costs. She didn't say goodbye to anyone, just packed up her things, pulled the shutters closed, and vanished like a storm that had finally blown itself out. A week later, her house was stripped of the pastel pink shutters she'd insisted all homes should have, and a new family moved in, a young couple who brought brownies to every neighbor on the block their first weekend. The neighborhood itself seemed to breathe easier. Rules were rewritten with community input, fines were reviewed and reversed where appropriate, and the new board members included a retired judge, a high school teacher, and an Army veteran. People waved at each other more. Kids played in driveways again. Someone even repainted the HOA office mailbox to read, "For the People." But the most surprising change came during our baby shower. A few neighbors organized a surprise party for us, transforming the community center into a warm, laughter-filled room filled with streamers, cake, and gift. One present stood out, a tiny white onesie with bold letters across the chest that read, "Born Free from Karen's HOA." The entire room erupted in laughter when we held it up. It wasn't just a joke, it was a symbol. We had stood up, fought back, and changed something that most people assume can't be touched. HOA power has always felt untouchable, like a shadowy hand behind a curtain. But this time, the curtain had been yanked wide open. We didn't just remove a bad actor. We exposed how quickly power can spiral when people are afraid to speak up. A few weeks later, as life returned to normal and we settled into late-night baby prep routines, I received a letter. It was from the district attorney's office, informing us that Karen had accepted a plea deal to avoid further criminal charges. She would avoid jail but be permanently barred from holding any leadership position in any HOA, housing authority, or community organization in the state. That might not sound dramatic to some people, but in our world, that was everything. Karen had built her entire identity around being in control. Now, legally, she couldn't control a single street lamp. I mounted the letter in a shadow box and hung it above the gun safe, the one she never even saw. It wasn't to gloat. It was a reminder that preparation, calm action, and truth win over threats and manipulation. A reminder of how close things came to going very wrong. A reminder that the quiet ones often carry the biggest response when pushed too far. That summer, as we brought our newborn son home, I stood on the porch with him wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun set over a quiet street where no black SUVs lingered, no clipboard-toting strangers paced the sidewalks, and no pastel-colored tyrants decided how high a flagpole could be. The chaos was behind us, but the lesson stayed sharp. You protect what matters. You stand your ground. And sometimes, when a thug pulls a knife, you remind the world why you built the safe in the first place.